to be able to welcome you to the left coast and all that we do here as well, because we just love celebrating the works of Mr. Doyle, of course, and of our great detective. So with that being said, we're going to talk about the Six Napoleons, which I'm sure you all know that was published in 1904. And it was later published as part of the compilation of the Return of Sherlock Holmes. So we thought what we would do today is talk a little bit about it. We've had a great time discussing everything from Sherlock's relationship with Lestrade to the politics of the time. And so we thought we'd just kind of bounce out with a couple of questions. If you'd like to voice your opinions and your thoughts, please unmute yourself and chat away. And if you have any questions about anything, don't hesitate to throw them in the chat. All right, so ready? You want to do the first question? Or?
Sure.
Okay, you throw the first question out.
So how does Sherlock Holmes become physically involved in the case of the adventure of the Six Napoleons?
Everybody's very quiet.
No, brings the case to Baker Street.
Yes, yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
And it was after a certain event that ended up intriguing Mr. Holmes more, which was the burglary, correct?
I think one of the things that appealed to me was in the very beginning, knowing that this is one of the last times or last cases that Lestrade is actively involved in or mentioned. I think there were only like two after this, was how you had got to see how his relationship with Sherlock had evolved, and that there was an easy camaraderie there, but there was also a great respect for Mr. Holmes and the relationship and how they actually worked together on the case. And you could see how Sherlock was pushing things through and working things out, sharing some things with Lestrade, but not all of it, but how they made a valuable contribution. He made a valuable contribution to the investigation.
And Irene,
Martha,
did you notice that Lestrade was in most of the scenes?
Yeah, that was.
I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
He played a very large part, like you say.
And it was fun to see how, I mean, Sherlock actually laid things out to where you could follow along easily in the case. Made it simple for Lestrade. That's the way to put it. But the admiration, I love the spontaneous applause that Watson and Lestrade burst into when all was revealed. That was great. So the next question we have is, how does Holmes make the connection to what's inside the bust in the adventure of the Six Napoleons?
Okay, I give. Go ahead.
I want to answer with a caveat, which was we had a crazy schedule last night, and so we were not able to read the story. So we listened to the Basil Rathbone adventure of the Six Napoleons, and I'm so happy about what I just heard said, because that Holmes was very rude to poor Dr. Watson and treated him disrespectfully. And so I'm so happy that that did not happen in the actual story. So in Basil's version, he made the connection that the only smashed Napoleons were the ones from that particular location. And that's how he concluded that there was something crucial, since they were not in themselves valuable statues.
Right.
Well, and it was interesting when they decided to investigate along with Lestrade, how Lestrade went off on one direction trying to determine who the murder victim was, and Holmes took Watson along with him to determine where the bust had come from.
Well, not only that, but to even, am I being heard at all?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great, thank you. Holmes, in his investigation, is making a connection between the surnames of the body that's found and the maid who was at the hotel, and how the pearl had gone missing from the hotel, and he'd been called in, so he had some, forethought, like some foreknowledge on that, and was able to connect those dots from the body to the maid to the pearl, and finally determined that, this guy's going to go for the one in London first, so I have time to take care of the other one and hedge my bets.
Right. And I thought it was really interesting in this case, more than any of the others that I've read, there were so many connections. In fact, I made a
Flow chart.
flow of the path that the 6 Napoleons made was just incredible. And so all the connections that Holmes brought Watson along with him, to me, exceeded far further than any other story that I've read. So I don't know if anybody answered that last question. I was hoping somebody would come up with the answer because I'm not quite sure.
One of the things I thought was that when they found the broken busts, they found one of the broken busts underneath the lamp. And so they said that there must be, Holmes said there has to be something inside the bust because it was taken to a place to examine it. And then it was, then they left there. So he thought that there must have been something inside the bust.
There's more than one reference. One was a street light, and then the other one was in for where one of the two that belonged to Dr. Barnicoat.
Right.
Make sure you say his name right.
Okay. Was it the garden?
No, the garden one he did outside. The other one he did broke inside because nobody would hear him, and there was
Right.
light by maybe it was Harker that had the red lamp. So
Yeah, because he was.
yeah. So
But let me, I don't want to say interrupt, but let me try to be a bit of my native New Yorker
Bob,
quasi aggressiveness. And because so many nice people tuned in spite of the fact that my name was on the Facebook ad. Let me follow up if it's okay with you with a couple of my own questions related to what you're bringing up and maybe to carry it forward. Maybe we'll go back and forth with some of your questions and some of mine, if that's okay with Linda.
Absolutely.
Linda and Beth. Is that cool? Good.
That's great.
Okay. Well, the first thing you brought up was how the story opens, which is really unusual in the sense that I guess the question I would ask is, why was Lestrade there?
Mhm.
What was he doing there that day?
Let's see if
Anybody?
He was there
Well,
because of the
Sandy.
breaking.
Let me get Sandy. Sandy,
Well,
go ahead.
To begin with, at this point, Lestrade is visiting Holmes anyway occasionally.
That's the point. It's that he wasn't there so much because of the break-in, but this had become what, Sandy?
Friends.
Friends, yeah. And remember, in the study in Scarlet, which takes place, and I see Vincent, is on the line. So I'm not really going to get into chronology, but I think I can get by Vincent by saying that this story takes place after A Study in Scarlet. I think I'm solid on that one. Right, good. Okay, good. Anyway, Vincent and I are kind of like opposite poles on chronology. He knows everything, and I've undertaken, ignorance is bliss. But anyway, the point is this story occurs after A Study in Scarlet. Remember what Holmes says about Lestrade in A Study in Scarlet? Remember what's his phrase? Anybody remember? Wave.
Is that
He and Greg Skinner are the pick of a bad lot.
He's the best of a bad lot. Yeah. So in whatever period of time is involved here, it's at least a few years, he goes from being sort of something about one step above a moron in Holmes's estimation to a guy that comes by on a regular basis to chat about crime. They're smoking cigars. They're probably having a drink. These guys are like buddies, and when Holmes and Watson go off after the Hound of the Baskervilles, which is pretty dangerous, and they're in the moor and it's dangerous and they've got guns, who do they ask to come with them? Lestrade, yeah. So to me, that one of the nice things about the canon is that in a lot of detective fiction, the detective you get in story 1 is the detective you get in story 32. Whereas in the canon, the people, not just Holmes and not just Watson, but the people that you get evolve. And I think that's a term that Linda and Beth use. And the characters evolve and develop, and they're not the same at the end of the canon as they were in the beginning. And that to me is part of the hold of it. That, you know, if you read one story about Detective X, and I'm not going to get people angry by mentioning detectives I don't think are interesting. You read the first two, and then, you know, they're the same at the end of their series. These guys change over time, and that's really kind of important. The other question I wanted is, because you've already brought up breaking the busts, and, you know, which is a big shtick of the story. Who does, to ask the easy question, what kind of busts are broken in this story?
Well,
The busts of who?
Plaster busts.
Napoleon.
The plaster bust of Napoleon. Right. Okay, now think of it. You know, Conan Doyle, you know, or Watson, doesn't matter. We're educated people. Every educated Englishman or woman, for that matter, because literacy was on the rise in those days, had probably read Dickens. They probably knew who Shakespeare was. They probably knew who Walter Scott was. And Conan Doyle really wanted to be the second Walter Scott. But instead of picking a bust of Shakespeare or a bust of Dickens or even a bust of Walter Scott, he picks a bust of Napoleon. Now, what does he tell us in a different story? And I'm not going to get into whether it's before or after this story, but in a different story, what does he tell us about a particularly important criminal?
Is the Napoleon of crime.
Right. Who is the Napoleon of crime, Jerry?
Moriarty.
Moriarty, right. So the greatest criminal in the canon is the Napoleon of crime. He picks a bust of Napoleon. Why do you think he does that? It's purely theoretical. So your opinion, there's no right or wrong answer. Your opinion is probably better than mine. Who has a thought as to why he picks Napoleon as opposed to Dickens or Shakespeare or?
And I thought it was rather interesting that he even went to Napoleon, because even though he says, oh, Sherlock says there's got to be hundreds of statues of Napoleon throughout London. Napoleon was not a well thought of person by any stretch of the imagination in England. So I was curious as to why he would pick Napoleon in that direction, but I love the connection between Moriarty and Napoleon.
And it could be because of his heredity with the French culture
French art.
through Vernet.
Yeah.
that
Right, he was related to Renee. Sandy, you've got your hand up.
The obvious thing, those were the statues that were in the place that he ran into. And there weren't a lot of them.
Well, that's true.
Yeah,
So,
well, they were ones that he
They
had
were
made.
there.
Yeah.
If they had been statues of elephants, if there had been 8 statues of elephants,
That's
he
true.
would have stuck it into the elephant.
Well, but Sandy, my point is that when Conan Doyle, and let's for a minute assume Conan Doyle
Oh, but he
wrote the
was Conan
story.
Doyle. Okay, I
He-
thought you.
Yeah, no, let's go back. Let's get really down to the motivation. You know, if Conan Doyle wanted this story to be the 6 elephants, you're right. He would have had statues of elephants, but it's the 6 Napoleons. And I mean, anybody else got a thought as to why he picks Napoleon? Beth and Linda, of course, right, that, you know, when mothers used to want to scare their children in England, they would say, Boney's going to get you. You know, he was like another term for the boogeyman. So he picks.
Well,
Napoleon.
that's
Who's Martin?
exactly right. You can't have really a theory of someone has a monomaniac, thing against an elephant, or not even Shakespeare, but Napoleon. He was such a controversial figure that it's easy to have somebody say, oh, well, this guy's crazy. He just so focused on Napoleon that he would go around smashing their busts.
I think it's called an E-Day fix, if I'm
Yeah,
pronouncing.
you know, that's what Watson, right? Watson tells
Well,
us.
and
Yeah, I've always thought that, you know, that Moriarty was the Napoleon of crime, because Napoleon, in a malevolent sort of way, was a symbol of greatness in England. Let's face it, a bad greatness, but greatness. So for Sherlock Holmes to take on a supervillain, if you will, because, you know, to create a superhero, you have to match him up with a supervillain. And this really starts in the canon, but, you know, we all know about Batman and the Joker and, you know, that kind of stuff. That's really a lineal descendant of Holmes and Moriarty. So you've got to create a supervillain. You've got to create a supervillain. And who was more of a villain in England than Napoleon, even many years after Waterloo? And so it's, in a way, I think to Conan Doyle, if you want to get somebody's attention, you bring up Napoleon, because it's not, you know, the first time that we see this in the canon. Just my view, but I've always noticed that. And let me again follow up something Linda and Beth said, similarities. And you pointed out, what'd you do, Linda? What'd you do, Beth? You have a timeline? What is your timeline? You made up a flow sheet, rather.
Oh, yeah.
What's the flow sheet? Well, yeah, I mean, what's on it? I can't read the.
What it starts with is where the bus emanated, you know, and so I followed the bus everywhere they went because I was having a hard time keeping it in my head as I read the story. Okay, well, you raised two really good points, and let's follow both of them for a minute. The first one is similarities, and I'm sorry, I see Karen raising her hand. You got to unmute yourself, Karen. Karen, go ahead. Yeah.
Just really quick before you move on, Robert, because I want to reply to something you said.
Sure.
About Napoleon, because another point is they were selling a lot of those busts. So somebody must have liked them, or they wouldn't have been manufacturing them.
So what's that about?
And he also mentions one other character in the story was a big admirer of Napoleon. So I'm just throwing that in.
No, I think your point's well taken, though, Karen, because Napoleon, whether he was popular or not, he was controversial and he was well known. And he was, in some sense, whether it was positive or negative, associated with grandeur. And even Englishmen, I'm sure, have gone to visit, you know, Les Invalides and seen his tomb, which, you know, is a lot more impressive than I think most of us are going to end up with. But anyway, but let's thank you. And let's get back for a minute to similarities. And there are two that struck me. One of which is the denouement of the story. And I've always made the comment that there are 60 stories in the canon and about 6 plots. And the way that this story is, if you will, brought to its real conclusion is the breaking of the bust, right? I mean, he's got this bust in Baker Street. He takes a hammer and he takes his riding crop, rather, hunting crop, and he knocks it, breaks the bust up. That's the same ending for all intents and purposes as another story in the canon. Did anybody notice that, at least other than me? There's another ending that he basically at some point or another rips off.
Blue carbuncle?
I'm sorry?
Blue carbuncle?
Well, the blue carbuncle, the jewel is in the crop, but they know at the beginning what they're looking for. And yeah, that's okay. I'll count that. That would be number 3 on my list.
Speckled band.
I put the 6 Napoleons, by the way, as number 2. But for this kind of a publicity stunt, what's number 1? And it says, so now we've got 3 times in the canon. What's the other story you can think of?
Well, there's the speckled band where he doesn't know what he's looking for, but it's not as dramatic as the breaking of.
Okay.
Oh,
how about serving
the naval
breakfast?
treaty?
How
naval
about
treaty.
serving breakfast?
Yeah, he serves up the naval treaty in the curry.
Right. He serves up the naval treaty in a dish of supposedly curried chicken, right? And everybody's sitting there, and they're gonna eat their breakfast, and they lift up the top of this dish, and boom, there's the naval treaty. I don't think it's a very big walk between lifting up a dish of curry and finding the naval treaty and breaking a bust of Napoleon and finding the Black Pearl of the Borgias. It's the same stunt. And Conan Doyle's really great at recycling this stuff and yet pulling it off and fooling us. So it's really kind of cool. And then Linda, yeah, go ahead. Linda and Beth.
A comment about how he took his crop and smashed that last Napoleon, which is the only one that they got to see in its original form. And the how it relates to Mr. Holmes smashing Napoleon, which makes him even greater because of the way that Napoleon was seen by the British public. So I just thought that was really interesting. He smashed Napoleon.
Yeah, you get that same sort of scene. If you remember, someone mentioned they listened to Basil Rathbone. If you watch the Jeremy Brett Speckled Band, to me, the great scene is when he takes, when the band is climbing down the Bellpool and he uses basically a whip or a riding crop or a hunting crop to go after the band. Howard.
So if now we make a modern version, a Sherlock type version of this film, are we going to use Mr. Putin instead of Napoleon?
Well, we would use Thatcher, evidently.
Well, I can tell you, at least speaking personally, I do have 6 small busts of Napoleon somewhere on my bookshelves in this house. I do not have a bust of Putin, and I certainly don't have a bust of certain other figures from the 1940s, but I can see your point.
I have Mr. Putin nesting dolls from when I visited Russia. So,
well, if I ever visit your home, Howard, hide it because I'll probably step on it.
Bob, you're going to be bringing it up.
Anyway, okay, so you mentioned, so Linda and Beth mentioned similarities, and we talked about this denouement with, lifting up a dish of curry chicken and finding the black pearl of the Borgias. The other one that you folks mentioned was how many places they go, and that's why I've got your flow chart and there's I want to emphasize. I always love to emphasize when we talk about stories, just what a good writer Conan Doyle was. I mean, he was, I think, one of the great descriptive writers in the English language. And there are 2 examples of that. And I think he's a great descriptive writer because of his economy of words. He manages to say so much in so few words and create so many vivid images. And I think the greatest of those examples is it takes him about 7 lines, and I counted them at least in the Doubleday issue. It takes him something like 7 lines to describe Professor Moriarty. And by the time he's done, you have this perfect view of what the guy looks like. In this story, he does the same thing. And remember, there's like, it's one long running sentence, but he says when they're going on their trip, he says, in rapid succession, we went to, and then he starts talking about neighborhoods, right? And something I think Linda and Beth must have on their flow chart. And he says they go to commercial London and theatrical London, and it's all one sentence. It's like a great running shot. And by the time you're done, it's incredibly vivid. Yeah, and it's just one sentence. The list instead of saying, we went to this neighborhood and it was dark, and we went to this neighborhood and it was raining, doesn't matter. He in one sentence, he takes you all through London, and it's like, wow, I know where they went. And you can it's so detailed that Linda and Beth can even do a flow chart. Wow. So he's such a good writer. And there's one phrase, every time I read, I think it's true for all of you, because I know many of you, and we're all kin spirits here. Every time I read the stories, one of these stories, there's some phrase I never noticed before, even if it's just 2 words. And this one blew me away because he describes someone who would shatter busts of Napoleon with a 2-word phrase, which is amazing. And Linda Beth is there. What phrase does he use?
Dangerous homicidal lunatic with Napoleonic delusions.
Well, that's one, but there's one that's even better.
One that's even better?
Yeah, if you can imagine. He calls somebody like this a promiscuous iconoclast.
Oh, iconoclast.
Yes.
Isn't that an amazing phrase? I don't think ever in my life I would think of putting those 2 words together. No. And yet it's like perfect.
It is perfect.
In relation to his description of where they went through in London, he goes from fashionable London, hotel London, theatrical London, literary London, commercial London, to maritime London.
I mean,
it's quite a.
You don't get a better sentence than that because it's so descriptive. You know exactly where they went, and to the extent that you can put it on a map, or you could do a flow chart like the 2 of you did. It's that, and it's one sentence, And I love promiscuous iconoclast. I've got to use that somewhere in writing or speech at some point. I can't get away with that.
Let us know, Bob, when you use it, because
I will. I'll give you full credit, Alan.
Yeah, we want to know.
Yeah, I wrote a paper for, wait for it, the 6 Napoleons of Baltimore, in which I showed that Conan Doyle evolved in his attitude toward Italians, at least in the literature. And quite apart from that fancy phrase you just gave, the actual perpetrator is described as something of a thug, and he kind of paints Italians with that kind of.
I think we just lost Alan. He's kind of
derogation,
frozen. There you go.
and yet later on in the Red Circle, he's very kind to the couple who are trying to escape from what is in essence the mafia, and it occurred to me that between the two stories, he honeymooned in Italy with Jean Lucky.
Right. Well, again, Alan brings up a point that gets back to what Beth and Linda said about similarities. Now, I'm going to agree with Alan to a point that he does speak kindly of the Italian couple in the Red Circle, but the fact is that there's, the mafia is involved in that story. And when you think about it, talk about similarities. One of to me, the great similarities throughout the canon is the concept that all bad things begin somewhere else.
Yep.
Right.
Different
Like
Not in
in
England.
day one, studying Scarlet, where does the bad thing begin?
Utah.
Utah, right.
Yep.
And let's see, the Dancing Men.
In Chicago.
Okay, where does the bad thing begin?
Chicago.
Begins in Chicago, right? And in both stories, even though Alan raises a fair point, in both the Six Napoleons and in the Red Circle, the bad thing begins either with Italians or in New York City, but it's always elsewhere. And Five Orange Pips, where does that begin?
In the South.
Begins in the American South. Yeah, it's like, and foreign countries are vast criminal conspiracies.
Yes.
When you think about it, how often does that happen? Even a major religion like Mormonism is a vast criminal conspiracy that begins in the United States and somehow goes to England, and there's even the implication that Moriarty really isn't British, he's Irish. He's there's that sense that his Moriarty's not named Winchester or Windsor or something like that. He's Moriarty, and that's a good Irish name. So
didn't the Speckled Man come from India?
Sandy, go ahead.
Didn't the Speckled Man come from India?
Well, not only did the Speckled Man come from India,
it.
but an Englishman went to India, right, which is where he turned bad, and then comes back to America. And even the Englishmen who are bad people frequently do become bad when they were abroad, and then they come back to England with like ill-gotten gain or something like that. Thor Bridge, when you think about it, the villain of Thor Bridge is Neil Gibson's a Gold King, right? It's not his wife who's sort of a put upon woman, and the real villain is Neil Gibson, who's American. I mean, he's even played on the Jeremy Brett show by the son of Raymond Massey, who's Canadian. It's xenophobia is such a common similarity between this story and everything else. Rich,
Wisteria Lodge.
Yeah, I mean, we could go through. And how about His Last Bow? The first story in the canon is Bad Things Come from America. The last story in the canon is Bad Things Come from where?
Germany.
Germany, right. And even in the first of the short stories, A Scandal in Bohemia, there's sort of not really a villain, but if there is, it's the King of Bohemia. And remember, only a German would be so unkind to his verbs.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, and
Mother
Irene's
English
from New
teacher,
Jersey, so
she
Yeah.
drummed grammar into my head, and I'm sure at some point she would have accused me of being unkind to my verbs. But no, it's Conan Doyle says only a German is so unkind. Let me just, before I turn things back to Linda and Beth, and if I'm hogging the show, please make a rude gesture at me or put me on mute or something. But